I'm Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today we keep reporting on the mysterious blast on a Russian tanker and the death of Russia's former transport minister. Meanwhile, Trump pledges to restart weapon deliveries to Ukraine, and we look forward to what may come out of President Macron's visit to the UK this week. Finally, we talk about what will happen to the Ukrainian children abducted by Russia if the main investigative effort, the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, shuts its door in the autumn due to lack of funding, and how no one has stepped up to fill the gap.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Tuesday, the 8th of July, 3 years and 135 days since the full-scale invasion began. Today, I'm joined by Associate Defense Editor Dom Nicholls, Executive Editor for Audio Francis Dearnley, and Executive Director of the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, Nathaniel Raymond. But as usual, let's turn to the military updates first with Dom.
So let's start in Russia. So yesterday we reported on how Russia's transport minister, Roman had been fired by Putin. We thought it may be because of the ongoing chaos at Russian airports, particularly over last weekend, and these mysterious explosions on shadow fleet vessels and other oil and gas carrying vessels, and I'll make clear why I stress that distinction shortly. However, just after we were on air yesterday, Mr. Starovoyt was found dead in his car from a gunshot wound, TASS, the Russian state media outlet, reported. A pistol awarded to him by Russia's Interior Ministry in 2023 was found in his Tesla Model X, according to Telegram channels linked to Russian security services. And Svetlana Petrenko, spokeswoman for the Russian Investigative Committee, said suicide is the primary version. She added that investigators were working at the scene. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin's chief spokesperson, said the dismissal, as in him being fired from his job, was not related to a loss of confidence in him. He was a long-standing member of Putin's United Russia Party. Now, 53-year-old Mr. Starovoyt, he had served as governor of Kursk region, the border region, or the region bordering Ukraine, from 2019 until May 2024. Now, so that was obviously before August's invasion by Ukraine. However, some reports in the Russian media have tied his firing to a probe into the embezzlement of funds meant to have constructed defences in Kursk Oblast. Now, in April this year, Alexei Smirnov, who was his deputy, he's now succeeded Mr. Starovoyt as governor in Kursk Oblast, he was arrested on charges of stealing $12 million worth of defence fortifications. And then Rosbusiness Consulting, that's a privately owned Russian media channel, said investigators had been probing Mr. Starovoyt's role in the scandal, which a lot of Kremlin allies have been blaming for Ukraine's success there last year and this year. Now, according to reports in Kommersant, that's a business-facing Russian newspaper, Mr. Smirnov had testified against Starovoyt in that case. Now, before his death, Dmitry Ilovsky, who's a political analyst, told that publication that, quote, the situation cast a shadow on him, on Mr. Starovoyt. He said the public has an unasked question. If there was corruption, then what is the responsibility of the former governor? Now, some of our colleagues here at the Telegraph have spoken to various Russian politicians in their little black books. They've reported that this mysterious death would send chills through Moscow. A current government member who was speaking on condition of anonymity said, quote, this is a very unhealthy signal for all of us and the system as a whole. A second government official said some people will be scared, others upset, those who have something to fear. So we've got no greater insight into it than that, but it does seem extraordinary, the timing. There undoubtedly is a personal tragedy at the base of this, but whether or not it's got something to do with Kursk, alleged corruption there, or anything going on in the transport industry, we don't know, but we will keep our eyes on it. Okay, now yesterday I spoke of that LPG, the liquefied petroleum gas tanker Eco Wizard, that was holed by 2 separate explosions on Sunday after loading up in the Russian port of Ust-Luga, just down the coast from St. Petersburg on the way to Estonia. So I've been following that up today. I've been speaking to Lloyd's List. Lloyd's being the news and analysis of global shipping industry related to the obviously part of the insurance company as well. Now, their assessment, Lloyd's List assessment, is that limpet mines are strongly suspected as having been the cause of these blasts on Eco Wizard and elsewhere. If confirmed, that makes Eco Wizard the 6th tanker linked to Russian operations to be hit by explosive devices this year. Now, the Eco Wizard on Sunday, 2 blasts blew into the engine room, caused a portside list in the vessel we spoke of, and a leak of liquid ammonia. All 23 crew reported safe, and that leak of ammonia was said to be under control. You'll remember yesterday the Russian authorities said the leak was just minor, which is fine. Bit of ammonia, just leaking around all over the place. Anyway, Russian divers were thought to have inspected the hull yesterday and said to have delivered a report, but we've not heard of that. The last suspected explosion, that was aboard a vessel called the Villa Mora off the coast of Libya on June the 27th, was confirmed by its owning company as a limpet mine attack. Now, 4 of these attacks, like I say 6 this year so far, 4 of the limpet mine attacks have taken place in Mediterranean waters, 2 off the coast of Libya, 1 off Italy, 1 off Turkey. And then all 5 of the previous 6 targeted this year had passed through Malta's outer port limits, so not part of a sort of a maritime area, so had gone through Malta. This is all perfectly normal activity. At least 2 of them had also visited Libyan ports. There was speculation that Malta was the centrepiece of this, that there was, well, who knows, a team on Malta that was targeting ships that had traded with Russia as they came into port. However, that theory has been thrown into some doubt. I mean, there could be more than one team, of course, but that was thrown into some doubt because Eco Wizard is, well, firstly, it's the second to have taken place in Ust-Luga. February, the Russia-owned Shadow Fleet tanker Koala suffered a similar explosion in Ust-Luga. But Eco Wizard's not been near Malta. All of the ships, however, have traded out of Russia in the last 6 months. Okay, so that's what we know so far. Some of them are sanctioned as Shadow Fleet vessels, but not all of them, and that could be the problem. This is why I want to raise it today. So Eco Wizard is flagged at the Marshall Islands, but it is owned by Stealth Gas, an American international shipping company that specialises in the transportation of petroleum and petrochemical gas products in liquid form. It's the world's largest owner of LPG pressurised containers, I read on their website, in the 3,000 to 8,000 cubic metre segment. Okay, so it is a perfectly legitimate US-owned vessel going about its lawful activity. Lloyd's say that Eco Wizard and Stealth Gas have not in any way been attempting to obfuscate the ownership of the ship or its activities. It is legitimately trading. So I raise it because if this is, as is suspected, some kind of Ukrainian covert operation, the HUR, Ukraine's military intelligence, did launch that amazing Operation Spiderweb a few weeks ago, the drone attack across deep inside Russia. So if this is something that they're also doing, maybe it is, well, it's going to raise some questions. If they're attacking a US-owned vessel going about its legitimate business, not sanctioned, that is unlikely to go down very well in the White House. So we're going to keep our tabs on that as well. But that was thank you to Lloyd's List for chatting to me this morning and talking me through all that. Okay, now, a year ago today, Ukraine's largest paediatric medical centre was hit in a strike by Russia. The blast at Kyiv's Okhmedit Children's Hospital killed 2 adults, injured at least 34 others. There were 627 children in the hospital receiving treatment at the time. Obviously got a lot of coverage at the time from us and others. Well, today, Ukraine's military intelligence department, the HUR, the HUR, as I've just said, has named Russian Armed Forces Major Denis Shaynov as allegedly involved in the missile strike. So according to HUR, Shaynov is the head of the Special Engineering Service of the 121st Heavy Bomber Aviation Regiment, which itself is part of Russia's 22nd Heavy Bomber Aviation Division. They are said to have been the outfit tasked with executing the strike. Now, although Ukrainian authorities have previously charged Russian Lieutenant General Sergei Kobylash in absentia for ordering the strike, they're saying today that 47-year-old Denis Shainov was responsible for the technical preparation of the X-101 air-launched cruise missiles used in that attack. Now, in an interview published yesterday in the New York Times, Ukrainian soldiers said to be operating near Konstantinivka said the deployment to that area since the spring of this year of Russian drone operators from their Rubicon Center, you'll remember that's Moscow's recently formed drone training and innovation center. This has represented a turning point in Russia's tactical drone capacity in the area. Now, the Institute for the Study of War, the US-based think tank, are saying that Russia reportedly deployed Rubicon drone units to Kursk Oblast earlier this year, where they, and in particular the fibre optic drones that they used, played a significant role in wearing down that remaining Ukrainian salient. Now, they are said to be operating in the Konstantinivka area and said to be significantly complicating Ukrainian logistics in that area. The ISW, just as a reminder, say Russian and Ukrainian use of these fibre optic drones in particular, and that Rubicon really introduced en masse in the Kursk Oblast, they say that's been the key role in this 15-20 kilometre wide, depending on the topography, gap between the front lines of Russian and Ukrainian positions. This drone wall that we've talked of, it's first-person view drones, and in particular the fibre optic drones, because you just can't jam them. Now, last night across Ukraine, Russia launched 54 drones and 4 S-300 or 400 missiles. 9 people were killed, 81 injured. Most of those deaths were in Sumy and Donetsk regions. Attacks caused casualties across the rest, mainly the east and the south of the country. One thing I'm tracking, there have been no move in the lines, nothing to talk of. One thing I'm tracking, there are reports coming out of the Zaporizhia region suggesting that Russia is pushing hard there, which is we've not heard that for quite a few months actually. A report I've seen from a battalion commanding officer in Ukraine's 65th Mechanized Brigade talks of Russia now massing a large number of groups, or small groups, 3 to 4 people in each, supported by drones and artillery, trying to push in the Zaporizhia region. So we will obviously keep our eyes on that. Now, a couple more for me. Former Deputy Chief of the Russian Army's General Staff, Colonel General Khalil Aslanov, he was sentenced yesterday to 17 years in prison over a scheme involving the theft of over 1 billion rubles. That's nearly $13 million US. This comes from, as in theft from Russian Defense Ministry contracts. This was reported by TASS, as I say, Russian state-owned TASS. Now, the Kyiv Independent says that a closed-door military court found Aslanov and 2 others guilty of embezzling millions from state contracts with Voen Telecom. That's a company providing telecom services to the Russian military. He was convicted of extorting about 12 million rubles, $150,000 in a bribe from the head of another military communications company. His 2 co-defendants received prison sentences too, although much shorter, 6 and 7 years, I think. Now, Aslanov was a former head of Russia's military communications unit. He served as Deputy Chief of the Army's General Staff from 2013. He was promoted to Colonel General in 2017 and then booted out of his post in 2020. And just finally, Switzerland, I saw yesterday, has allocated 5 billion Swiss francs, just over $6 billion US worth, for Ukraine's reconstruction. And that's us up to date, Adélie.
Thank you, Dom. And now over to Francis for the diplomatic updates.
Well, thanks very much, Adélie. The row over the frozen US weapons deliveries to Ukraine continues. The latest being that President Trump, in what some are calling a U-turn, has pledged to send more weapons to Ukraine. Speaking to reporters during a dinner with Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu at the White House last night, he said the country was getting hit very, very hard and that they have to be able to defend themselves. We're going to have to send more weapons, defensive weapons primarily. Sean Parnell, the chief Pentagon spokesman, confirmed shortly afterwards the Department of Defense is sending additional defensive weapons to Ukraine to ensure the Ukrainians can defend themselves while we work to secure a lasting peace and ensure the killing stops. Now, straight off the bat, I would urge real caution here until we see the details. The wording is vague, and to save face, it's almost certain that figures in the Pentagon will be hesitant to resume what was previously pledged. Defence Secretary Pete Hegseth reportedly backed the freeze, though yesterday he was nodding along as Trump reversed the decision. Many believe Elbridge Colby, Trump's Undersecretary of Defence for Policy, was the real mastermind behind the reversal, justifying it on the basis of his pivot to the Pacific, though the reasons were rather unconvincing when one actually looked at the details. Colby was a vocal critic of America's policy in its support of Ukraine during the Biden administration and used to get in debates with people on X about it. As a consequence, a lot of attention has been focused on him in recent days. According to a report by the Wall Street Journal, Trump told Zelensky that he was not responsible for the halt in weapons deliveries to Kyiv. And that actually does seem to be true in this instance, though, again, it would be healthier, I believe, for Europe in particular to imagine that Trump's support had dried up completely and to act on that strategic premise. How much does this Trump whispering distract from action in European capitals, I wonder? Now, speaking of the continent, after failing to approve the 18th package of sanctions against Russia due to opposition from Hungary and Slovakia, EU countries are expected to finalise an agreement this week, says Kyiv. So, again, it appears that a deal has been done with Budapest and Bratislava, but what and from where, and is it always going to be the case? You'll recall it was the Americans who played a significant role a few months back in keeping pressure on Russia. But is that always going to remain true? Are they always going to be there to strong-arm the Hungarians in particular? And if not, what will that mean? We discussed in recent episodes, and we should all be paying close attention to the outcome of President Macron of France's state visit to Great Britain over the next few days. As we speak, he's just touched down and has been greeted by the King. Trailing the visit, he praised Sir Keir Starmer's willingness to improve ties with the EU and to explore new means of cooperation that respect our mutual interests. Now, many are reading that as commentary on discussions regarding Brexit and trade rather than defence. But, to Dom's point on Friday, if we don't leave this interaction without some substantial progress on weapons procurement, many would read that as indicative of a worrying direction of travel, given London and Paris were two of the more hawkish members of the so-called coalition of the willing. Zelensky spoke to Starmer yesterday about the upcoming meeting of that group in Rome in a few days' time, saying that they would be discussing additional funding to be provided this month for Ukraine's domestic drone production, primarily interceptor drones. From where we were a few months ago, one cannot help but feel the sense of urgency has evaporated, which brought European leaders together over multiple weeks, including in Kyiv, don't forget, to try and compel Moscow to agree to a ceasefire or face severe consequences. But none of those threats seem to have amounted to much, and the result is some of the fiercest attacks Ukraine has endured of the entire war. But Russia is not having it all its own way. We've reported in the past few weeks numerous instances of those major shutdowns at Russia's key airports due to Ukrainian drone attacks. Often they're interpreted as symbolic, but we should reflect on the economic impact. As reported by the Kyiv Independent, the pro-Kremlin outlet Kommersant has estimated the cost of the shutdowns over the past few days alone as likely costing Russian airlines around 20 billion rubles. That's around $254 million, citing airline representatives and industry experts. As the Independent summarises, since the start of mass disruptions on July 5th, a total of 485 flights were cancelled, 88 were diverted, and another 1,900 were delayed across major hubs. The drone attacks prompted operational shutdowns that triggered widespread logistical and economic consequences. Over 94,000 passengers were housed in hotels, and 43,000 refunds were processed, and hundreds of thousands of vouchers for food and drinks issued. The estimated financial toll includes direct airline losses from cancelling Boeing 737-800 flights, estimating between 15 million and 23 million rubles each, depending on the route. Experts say the true cost could be far higher. Some estimate tens of billions of rubles in additional indirect losses, including missed connections, taxi and hotel losses, and supply chain disruptions. Now, suffice to say, this is not going to be enough to topple the Russian economy, but it's still a cost which injects pressure into the state, a pressure which may have just exploded in the form of the death of Russia's transport minister. Whether that will help or hinder Putin's grip on power remains to be seen, but it is important we mark these moments. The news that Trump seeks to impose an additional 10% tariff on BRICS countries will already have some economists jittery in Moscow, though it's still a long, long way from the kind of financial weaponry which would need to be brought to bear to really threaten Russia's war machine. Which brings us back to the key question of the moment, really. On Russia, are Trump's eyes in the process of slowly opening or slowly closing? But it's a question which, in the very act of asking it, conveniently distracts from decisions that could be being taken now. But that's where we are in the political realm, Adélie.
Thank you, Francis. And today we're delighted to welcome back to the podcast Executive Director of the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale University, Nathaniel Raymond. He's one of the leading sources in the world for information on the mass deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia. Regular listeners will know that the lab was sharply defunded by the Trump administration when Trump took office in January. And there were reports that vital testimony and data had even been deleted as a result. So we're going to hear the latest on all of that shortly. But first, welcome, Nathaniel.
Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for dialing in early on in your day. The last time you were on the podcast was about 6 months ago. Francis asked you about the figure of 19,000 kidnapped children. It keeps on being cited, but it's not been updated in almost 2 years. So can you give us an overview of where the children's situation is at in the fourth year of the war? And what is your current estimate of the overall situation that you've been investigating?
So to answer the last part first, our internal assessment at the Humanitarian Research Lab at Yale is we believe over 35,000 children. And I'll say a little bit more about that number in terms of it not being one group of kids. It's about 4 groups of kids. We think there are over 116 locations holding children taken from Ukraine by Russia. We're working right now with the funding we've raised primarily online with the help of Hillary Rodham Clinton and others. So we're still running on fumes, but we're going to make it to October at least. We don't know how much longer beyond that, but our goal is to update the numbers publicly to a high confidence standard in time for the UN General Assembly in September. So that's our current focus. When we talk about that 35,000, which we think is probably double the Ukraine government number, which is that 19,000 plus, we're talking about 4 groups of kids. We're talking about kids that are in the camp settings for re-education. We're talking about kids taken from institutions that make up the majority of those in the adoption and fostering pipeline. And then we're also talking kids taken from the battlefield, particularly in the first phase in Mariupol in 2022, and kids separated from their parents directly in the filtration program. So that 35,000 is aggregate of those 4 groups of kids.
And so today I want to talk more specifically about the funding from your lab, because it's been a point of concern for a lot of our listeners. We had a lady at an event last week ask us specifically about where it was at. You just mentioned raising funds online. Is that at the moment your one source of income for the next 3 months? And what are you looking at after that?
Yes, it's our only source of income. We do not have U.S. government funding at this point, despite massive efforts going on by the Democrats and the Republicans to get the Trump administration to release the $8 million that has been basically notified to Congress by State Department to be spent on us, appropriated by Congress. And that money is sitting somewhere in a bank account between Kyiv and Foggy Bottom. So in the absence of that money or money from European governments, we're relying on the kindness of strangers, as they say in the United States. We are raising money online and working with individual donors behind the scenes. We need to raise $5 million for 1 year of operations on the kids. We've raised just south of $1 million, somewhere around 700,000 plus. So we're going week to week. Just to give people a sense, what we've done to this date has been able we were to shut down on July 1st. We've gotten our termination notices with the university extended a month, and we think we have about 2 more months or so, or a month and a half in the can. But we're basically doing the academic research equivalent of living off of credit cards.
One of the concerns that were brought up by this lady at the event last week was what happened to the database. So do you mind explaining what's been happening to it in the last few weeks?
Yeah, I can tell you specifically. We finished our mission with the State Department. So when we were terminated in February, we were in the middle of a 6-week contract with the State Department to take our database, which was not just about kids. I want to make this clear. It was the totality of our 3.5 years with the Conflict Observatory program at State. And it was a corpus of war crimes information, much of which had been shared actively with the International Criminal Court as it was being produced. That 3.5 years of data was across attacks on power generation infrastructure. Yes, kids, not just in Russia, but also in Belarus. It was chain of command data, and it also included attacks on agricultural infrastructure, attacks on hospitals, and detailed bomb damage, battle damage analysis, plus the results of 10 other investigations that had not been public, that were mutual support investigations we were involved in through Department of Justice and requests by Office of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine on very specific cases. And so we were terminated. And for about 5 days, and I want everyone to listen closely to this because I think this is my first time saying it publicly. For 5 days, we in the State Department didn't know where the database was after the termination. And everyone is assuming that the Trump administration intentionally destroyed it. But what really happened is there wasn't a plan. When they just shut off our money, they just shut off the system. I don't think the Trump administration even knew the database existed. And then they realized they had a problem, and everyone was trying to see if a copy was made. It turns out a copy was made incidentally, almost accidentally, by a subcontractor. And if that hadn't happened, the database data exhibits that basically on specific issues we had been collecting evidence on would have been lost. For about 5 days, everyone, including State Department and Congress, was pretty clear it wasn't in the system because it wasn't in the system. And so it was more Veep than House of Cards. Everyone was running around trying to find where it was. And we did find it. And then we were reinstated. And when we were reinstated, our mission was to hand it over to Europol and to the government of Ukraine, which has now happened. It happened the first week of June. And at that point, then our U.S. government funding ended and that mission was closed. And so what the problem then is that the $8 million for us to do another year, specifically on the kids, was not released, and it's just sitting somewhere.
That must have been an incredibly stressful 5 days.
I think I aged about 10 years in 5 days.
Yeah, you bet. I want to talk a little bit about who could be filling the gap in terms of funding if the money continues to be held on a bank account in the US. MPs here in the UK have expressed their concerns several times about your lack of funding. It's happened once in a parliamentary session on May 21st. There's also been a motion filed in April, backed by the Lib Dems, which, and I quote, urges the government to commit to filling the funding gap for the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab, ensuring it can continue its vital work. Can you tell me whether you've had any conversations with the British government about funding and what the answer has been?
Yes, we've had conversations. I can't give you the specifics on that, but the result is they declined to fund us. And I don't know why. And so basically, we don't have funding support from the United Kingdom. And we're in the process of, with the European Union and mainland countries in Europe in a process of finding out what's going to happen next. A few weeks ago, or more than that, there was a European Parliament resolution calling for us to be funded by the EU. It's now at least a couple months since that happened, and we don't know whether that money's coming. So at this point, basically, we're having to fend for ourselves. And there's something I want to say very clearly here. I said this when I addressed the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe in Finland, and I need to say it here. If we think back to 9/11, there were 2,995 missing persons on that day at Ground Zero. The FBI deployed 3,000 agents with 4,000 support personnel. So it was around a 2.5 to each missing person agent and support personnel ratio. About $250 million was spent on that missing persons investigation over an area that was 14.5 acres. And it took almost 18 years to complete. Here, we have the single largest child abduction since World War II. It's probably 35,000 children spread out over 3,500 miles. The primary investigators on this is, just wait for it, the epidemiology department at the Yale School of Public Health, combined with the elements of a government under constant bombardment. And that's about it, looking for these kids. Maybe $10 to $15 million has been spent on investigative efforts. And so I'm getting increasingly frustrated when governments and individuals, celebrities, et cetera, are making statements about the kids. We have invested jack squat in this mission. And it's the way I say, it's like canoeing to the moon here. We're running out of money. We don't have sustained support. And we are, unfortunately, we are the most credible source of intelligence assistance to the Ukrainians. And we're a bunch of people at the epidemiology department at a university. And so this isn't how it should be done. But it's where we are due to a lack of any concerted coordination on an international level about the actual intelligence and law enforcement support element here. And we should all be pretty much ashamed of ourselves.
It's terrifying because these children are growing, and the more they're growing and the more then time passes, the more they're lost, really. I wanted to go back to the EU funding quickly, and then I know Francis has a couple of questions as well. So you mentioned the resolution in May, which I was going to mention. There's going to be another resolution on Thursday this week in the Parliament, which, I quote, regrets that the EU was unable to help Yale's Humanitarian Research Lab secure sufficient funding. So does that mean that the EU, just like the British government, has officially refused to fund your lab, or are you having any further conversations? Is that a dead end on both of these avenues?
Well, the United Kingdom said no. And in terms of the EU, question mark, I don't know yet. To quote Wallace Shawn in The Princess Bride, I'm waiting. That's sort of my view on the EU funding. At this point, we just need somebody to say there's a process. And in the absence of that, as I said before, we're fending for ourselves on our own, and we're not going to give up. I've referred to this a lot as our Dunkerk moment. We're stuck on the beach and we're waiting to get rescued so we can get back in the fight. And I'm done doing all the diplomatic niceties. Someone's going to come save us so we can go save the kids. And so our posture right now is, I don't know how we're going to make it, but failure is not an option.
Nathaniel, it's fantastic to have you on the podcast, albeit distressing as well to hear what you've just been saying. You've answered two questions that have been on my mind for a very long time, as listeners will know. First, around the updated figure on the number of kidnapped children, but also what happened to that valuable testimony. Before I get into more subjects relating to what Russia has done with those children, because I think we should also reflect a little bit more deeply on that and what your research has told us, I just wanted to ask one question about this funding issue, which is how much are we talking here? Do you have a precise figure as to what is required to secure that?
5 million USD, and we've been pretty clear about that. There's a price tag right on the side of our car in the car lot here, and it hasn't changed. So it's 5 million, and we're basically trying to get as close to that number as quickly as possible through our own efforts.
And is that per year, or is that in total to guarantee for longer term?
No, that's 1 year. And the reason why that number is so important is because it involves not just us looking for the kids, but building data support systems to leave behind to support Ukrainian efforts. And so, people have to understand that this isn't just about tracking the kids, quote unquote. It's about developing also means for combining and sharing data safely and effectively. So if this was a domestic kidnapping case, not with 35,000 kids, but say 1 to 2 kids, within the first 3 hours of the child's alleged abduction, that kid would be in a case management system that would be connecting to state level, municipal level, and international level law enforcement. And that data would be shared in a bolo, be on the lookout throughout all those systems. Right now, Ukraine needs a lot of support, and they're doing the best they can, but they need a lot of support on data management systems to be able to integrate that data for it to be as effective as possible. And we're talking about a lot of different types of data that differs amongst the different groups of kids. And so supporting us is also basically supporting capacity building in the Ukrainian government.
Thank you. Now, turning to the subject of how Russia is doing this, I remember the last time we spoke about this, you were obviously naming individuals concerned and talked in great detail based on your research and your reports on just how this was being perpetrated. But can I ask, have you noted any shifts in policy in terms of how this is taking place? What's evolved over the last 6 months or so in terms of the information you've required? What has changed, if anything?
Well, in December, we briefed the United Nations Security Council on the result of our investigation and infiltration into the Russian national adoption databases, where basically children who were taken from institutional settings in Ukraine were basically being put up for adoption and fostering, and as if they were orphans from Russia. And that was a really critical turning point in the investigation, and it was a very difficult ethical and operational decision because we found 314 kids that were up for fostering and adoption, many of whom were in that database. And they were, the ones we found were from Donetsk and Luhansk. But we know for a fact that there are children in that database we haven't been able to identify by name yet that are from other temporarily occupied territories. The thing is that database is basically booby-trapped in the sense that it's being monitored by Russian security services, as are other corpuses of data related to the kids. And so a lot of open source investigators, law enforcement agencies, news organizations have been touching this data. And in so doing, they may have put the data at risk because they're being watched. So part of what we're really concerned about right now is that if we go back in time to 2022, this whole thing, the children's program by Putin, was a scale up of re-education and child placement operations that have been going on since 2014 in the initial incursions. But the program evolved over time. And when Russia started to lose in the summer of 2022, it really became a propaganda operation where they were using the kids to build support with Russia's domestic political audience. And then the ICC indictments happened. That really was the third phase. When the ICC indictments happened, they started to conceal elements of this program. And it was really South Africa for the Russians that caused them to understand they were in big trouble, which South Africa had a Supreme Court decision in the summer of 2023 that canceled Putin's visa to go to BRICS summit. And that was really the first time on the kids issue after the indictment that they saw real diplomatic pain. And then we enter into the phase we're in now, which I call phase 4. In the past 6 months with the negotiations, the worst thing we had worried about happening has happened, which is the kids are being used as a poker chip in a dangerous card game by the Russians And most recently, in the past few weeks, the Russians have said, okay, for every 2 POWs of ours you return, we'll give you a kid. And so that's where we are now, is really the changes about concealment of information, the information being in danger, and also the kids being used as leverage in negotiations. And that should concern all of us, because if the children are used in this next phase as basically hostages, it's going to cause permanent damage to the Geneva Convention in the future and the special protected status of children, where it's going to give the green light to everyone in the wars of the future to take kids and then trade them as leverage in end of war negotiations. And that's the sum of all fears here.
I very much agree, Nathaniel, and we have been reporting on how Russia has been using children as leverage in the negotiations, as you just described. One final question very briefly. How are we doing in terms of bringing some of these children home? How are those efforts going?
Save Ukraine, the government of Ukraine, Bring Back Kids, UA, they're working around the clock here, and they've had a lot of success recently with exfiltrations and negotiated returns in some cases of kids. But we're still around only 1,400 returned out of a potential at least 35,000. And so each kid back is significant, but it is, I don't want to say it's a drop in the bucket, but it's not where we should be. We should be talking returns of large tranches of thousands of kids. But instead, it's really this catch-as-catch-can effort by the incredible heroes in Save Ukraine and Ukrainian civil society working with the government. Why we're so frothing at the mouth to get our funding resolved is we just want to be supporting active identification of locations, large amounts of kids at specific locations in real time, and names of kids to be able to get that wheel spinning faster on the return side. And so our entire team is just absolutely desperate to get back up to full capacity so we can be trying to get that return cycle going as quick as possible. That's our real frustration right now.
One last question from me, Nathaniel, before we go to final thoughts. If you were to shut down and you were to stop your investigations, would that mean that we'd see a decrease or the exfiltration of the children just stop? Would that be one of the consequences?
It wouldn't stop. Nothing's going to stop the Ukrainian efforts to get these kids back, but it sure as hell wouldn't help it. And this is the thing here, is that I would love for there to be another team magically hidden somewhere that's doing exactly what we're doing. We haven't seen them yet. And we would love them to step in. If the UK government doesn't want to fund us, okay, fund somebody, great. But there isn't another body to fund another org. And so there should be 10 of us, right? There should be a whole consortium of well-funded organizations that are experts in doing this stuff. It shouldn't just be us. But right now, there isn't other capacity doing this work and doing it effectively to support the Ukrainians. And so if we, as sort of the last light on the dashboard here, go out of business, it's not going to help get those kids back. And right now, I worked a case in Guatemala several years ago, one of the first children-specific abduction cases I was on, and we were able to use DNA to reunite children that were in the American adoption system with their parents. And those kids were taken in the 80s. When they were reunited with their parents, they were in their mid-30s. And I don't want to see that happen here. But every day we keep going on like this without the resources necessary, the chance, the likelihood, the inevitability that if these kids get home, they're going to be getting home in their 30s and 40s goes through the roof. And we got to be clear about that.
Yeah, that's terrifying. And I really hope there are people listening to us right now and in the podcast who can make note of what you've just said. Thank you very much, Nathaniel. This was very moving. Let's move on to final thoughts. Dom, do you want to start?
Yeah, thanks, Adélie. So, noting that today President Macron, is in London for a state visit, I note that July the 8th is also today was 82 years since 1943 when Jean Moulin, a giant of the French resistance, was killed. He set up the organised resistance movement in France, codenamed Max. He was betrayed, tortured and died en route to a concentration camp in Germany, aged 44. So tonight I'm going to raise a glass to him, and I'm going to raise a glass to everyone in occupied Ukraine performing acts of resistance today. And I urge anyone in positions of power with ability to influence decisions over the sending of weapons or the ability to tell national leaders that we now think 35,000 kids have been taken by Russia. Please emulate Jean Moulin's spirit of resistance and don't take the easy route of ducking awkward conversations.
Thank you, Dom. Before we close off, we asked the Foreign Office whether the British government had indeed refused to fund the Yale Humanitarian Lab, and I just want to read out their response. The UK government has taken action to sanction those supporting Putin's attempts to forcibly deport and indoctrinate Ukraine's children and erase their Ukrainian cultural heritage, and we are an active member of the International Coalition for the Return of the Ukrainian Children. We work closely with the government of Ukraine on a variety of measures to hold Russia to account for its illegal actions, including supporting human rights defenders in the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission to document and report violations and abuses of human rights. That was their response. No word about the lab. Francis?
Well, thanks, Adélie, and thank you again, Nathaniel, for joining us today and for all of your work, and to everybody who's written in to us recently. I wanted just to read a few letters out. I recently had the pleasure and privilege, says Peter, of taking on an English language student, a Ukrainian refugee living in the UK, who was taking the exam to gain a qualification. It was hugely inspiring for me to hear on the podcast Lord Ashcroft say, "I believe that if each of us does what we can with what we have, it amounts to a big effort." And in that spirit, I plan to read out soon messages from many of you who've done volunteer work relating to the war. We've had some really extraordinary ones recently, and it warrants its own section, so just bear with me on that. But I'll end with a letter from Satoshi in Kyiv, who writes as follows. As a Belgian and Canadian citizen with Japanese ancestry, I lived in Switzerland, Canada, and now in Ukraine. Upon the commencement of the invasion, I made a decision to support people fighting for freedom and relocated to Kyiv as a volunteer. Like many foreigners, I find myself more comfortable in Ukraine than abroad, likely due to the fact that when an air alert is issued, I can simply glance out the window to ensure that everything is under control in my immediate vicinity, and the army keeps doing an incredible job protecting us. My mother endured the devastating bombings on Tokyo during World War II. Notably, she narrated to me how some of our school classes were conducted in a bomb shelter, although she continues to struggle to articulate the events of the bombings of March 1945. Her family refused to contribute to Japan's war of aggression. Ultimately, they lost their business and house and were forced to relocate to a small apartment. Better die with your values than live with someone else's. 80 years later, one can see the cost of bravery in her eyes, as well as the rewards in her heart. With that in mind, your work is giving voice to Ukraine, and it is invaluable, a historical record. You reflect very well the resilience, courage, distress, humour and love of good food of the Ukrainian people. I'd be interested to hear more from those who usually go unnoticed. I admire Ukraine's punctual train service, surpassing that of Western countries. Additionally, the rapid electricity restoration after a strike is noteworthy due to its complexity. I also think the street vendors deserve recognition for their resilience. My life is a well-protected one, relatively comfortable compared to those who cannot leave the country, have to make a living, or have loved ones in temporary occupied territories. I feel privileged to be able to witness the hardship firsthand, spread the word, and help a little, although I'd like to do more. Before my spouse died at age 36 of cancer, she taught me bravery and empathy. Despite the pains in her bones and despair, she was the one supporting me. Among other things, she told me that things would be fine in a world after her. She was mistaken on that one. I miss her, the world misses her, as much as the world misses people like David. Since that time, I've found solace in knowing that witnessing a loved one die in a war is worse than by sickness. My thoughts and actions go to survivors and to all who fight for the freedom to create sense in one's universe. Well, thank you very much, Satoshi, for that very moving message, and to all of you who write in every day.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and in those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest newsletter. Each week, Dom Nicholls and Francis Dearnley answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights. Plus, maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the description to this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each day on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Rachel Porter. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Nicholls.
My name is David Nicholls. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.